Before a single American rifleman ever set foot on European soil, the German army had already decided what he would be. They had spent years deciding it. This was not a guess made in a hurry, not a slogan shouted at a rally. It was a professional judgment, assembled slowly by serious men in quiet rooms, cross-checked, filed, and passed up the chain to the people who ran the most feared military machine on earth. Germany had studied the United States the way a surgeon studies an X-ray. They read our field manuals. They translated our service journals. They sent officers to watch our maneuvers in Louisiana and came home with notebooks full of observations. And at the end of all that careful work, they wrote down a conclusion that would help destroy their country. They decided we were shopkeepers. Not cowards, exactly. That was too crude for the German officer corps, and they prided themselves on precision. What they meant was something more specific, and in their minds, more damning. They believed America had produced a people so comfortable, so individualistic, so wrapped up in commerce and Sunday afternoons and the price of a new car, that we had simply lost the capacity for the thing they understood as war. We could make things. Nobody doubted that. But making things and fighting were different disciplines, and they were confident that the second one could not be bought. Here is what makes that judgment so haunting. It was not stupid. Given what they were looking at in 1941, it was almost reasonable. Consider the men doing the assessing. The German General Staff was the oldest continuous body of professional military thought in the world, an institution that traced its bloodline back through Moltke to Scharnhorst, to the wreckage of Prussia's defeat by Napoleon. Its officers were educated in a tradition that treated war as a craft passed down through generations, like violin making. You did not simply learn it, you were formed by it, over decades under men who had themselves been formed. Every one of their assumptions about what made an army dangerous ran through that idea. Discipline, initiative at the small unit level, officers who could read a battlefield the way a musician reads a score, the willingness of a man to keep advancing when everything in his body screams at him to lie down. Now look at what they saw when they turned their instruments on the United States. In the summer of 1940, while the German army was taking France apart in 6 weeks, the United States Army ranked somewhere around 18th in the world by size. 18th, below Romania, below the Netherlands, whose country the Germans had just swallowed in 5 days. Our soldiers trained with wooden mock-ups because the real weapons did not exist yet. Trucks and maneuvers carried signs on their sides, identifying them as tanks, because there were not enough tanks. Men drilled with broomsticks. Artillery crews practiced with lengths of pipe. There is footage of this, and if you watch it cold, without knowing what comes next, it does not look like the birth of anything. It looks like a joke a small nation plays on itself. Our officer corps was thin and old. Most of the men who would command armies in Europe were majors and lieutenant colonels in their 40s, some of them still in the ranks they had held for a decade, waiting for a promotion system that moved like a glacier. Eisenhower had never commanded troops in combat. Neither had Bradley. The last real fighting the American army had done at scale was in the Argonne in 1918, and the men who remembered it were mostly retired. Meanwhile, Germany had rewritten warfare. Poland in 5 weeks, Denmark in a day, Norway, the Low Countries, and then France, the country with what everyone in Europe agreed was the finest army on the continent, folded in less time than it takes a season to change. By December of 1941, their divisions could see the spires of Moscow through field glasses. They were not bluffing about their competence. They had earned every bit of the terror their name carried. So, when the reports came in from Pearl Harbor and Hitler stood up in the Reichstag 4 days later and declared war on the United States, the men in the German planning offices did what professionals do. They pulled out their papers and started calculating. They were not panicked. Read the assessments, and what strikes you is how calm they are. America is far away. America has almost no army. America has to build one from nothing, train it, equip it, and then move it 3,000 miles across an ocean that German submarines are currently turning into a graveyard. The most optimistic estimate anyone in Berlin produced gave the Americans 2 years before they could put a meaningful force into Europe, and most estimates said 3. In 2 or 3 years, the planners reasoned, the Soviet Union would be finished. Britain would be starving. The war in Europe would be over, and the Americans would arrive at a locked door. There is a detail here that almost nobody talks about, and it still stops me cold when I think about it. 5 months before Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt had ordered the War Department to answer a question. If America had to fight a global war, what would it actually take? The job of writing the answer fell largely to a major on the War Plans Division staff named Albert Wedemeyer, and what he produced became known as the Victory Program. It was an extraordinary document. It laid out the number of divisions, the aircraft, the shipping, the tonnage of steel and aluminum and rubber. It was, in effect, the blueprint for how the United States intended to build the largest military force in human history. On the 4th of December, 1941, 3 days before the Japanese planes came over Oahu, the Chicago Tribune printed it. The whole thing, a leak from inside Washington, splashed across a front page for anyone in the world to read. Berlin got a copy almost immediately. German intelligence poured over it. And here's the part that should be taught in every staff college in the world for the rest of time. They read America's actual war plan, the real one, with the real numbers in it, and they decided it was propaganda. Not maliciously, they just could not make the figures fit inside their understanding of what a nation was capable of. The tonnage was absurd. The division counts were fantasy. No country could do that, so obviously no country intended to. It had to be a bluff, a piece of theater meant to frighten them into caution. They filed it and moved on. That is how the whole thing begins, not with a battle, with a document that told them the exact truth and was disbelieved because the truth was outside the range of things a serious man was permitted to believe. The unraveling came slowly, and it came first to the people whose job was arithmetic. Picture one of those men. An officer in an intelligence section in Berlin, a career analyst, careful, unromantic, the kind who irritates his superiors by refusing to round numbers in a favorable direction. His work is unglamorous. He reads foreign newspapers, which are not censored in America and are therefore a fire hose of useful information. He reads shipping registries. He tracks steel output, machine tool orders, aluminum allocations. He builds a picture the way an accountant builds a ledger, and by the middle of 1942, his ledger has stopped making sense. The ships are the first thing. He knows, because everyone in his profession knows, roughly how long it takes to build a merchant vessel. A cargo ship of 10,000 tons is a serious undertaking. In a good European yard, with skilled riveters working from the keel up, you are talking the better part of a year. That number is not a matter of opinion. It is a fact about the physical world, like the boiling point of water. Then the Americans start turning out something they call the Liberty ship. It is not a beautiful design. It is deliberately, almost insultingly plain, a hull adapted from an old British tramp steamer, built to be adequate and nothing more. But the Americans are not building them the way ships have always been built. A man named Henry Kaiser, who has never built a ship in his life, who made his money on roads and dams, looks at a shipyard and sees an assembly problem. So he stops building ships and starts building pieces of ships. Whole sections, fabricated inland by people who have never seen the ocean, welded instead of riveted, trucked to the water and lifted into place by crane. The construction time collapses. 8 months becomes 4, 4 becomes 2, 2 becomes 1. In November of 1942, a yard in Richmond, California, assembles a ship called the Robert E. Peary from the laying of the keel to the launch in 4 days and 15 hours. And then, because Americans cannot resist showing off, they load her and send her to sea. The analyst in Berlin runs the comparison that matters. The U-boat campaign is Germany's best weapon against Britain, maybe its best weapon in the entire war. In the good months, the wolf packs are sinking Allied merchant tonnage faster than it can be replaced. And if that continues, Britain simply runs out of food and oil and stops being a combatant. The whole strategy rests on that arithmetic, staying in Germany's favor. By the summer of 1943, it has flipped. The Americans are launching hulls faster than the entire German submarine fleet. At the peak of its success, with its best crews and its best boats, can put them on the bottom. Not slightly faster, multiples faster. The graph the analyst is drawing does not converge. It diverges, and it keeps diverging, and no plausible improvement in submarine performance closes it. That is a strange kind of horror to experience at a desk. There is no explosion, nothing burns. A man simply looks at two lines on a page and understands that a war has been decided, and he cannot get anyone above him to look at the same page and see the same thing. The aircraft numbers are worse. Outside Detroit, Ford builds a factory at a place called Willow Run that is over a mile long, a single building under a single roof, laid out to do to a 4-engine bomber what Ford had done to the automobile. Early on, it is a disaster. The critics call it Will It Run? Aircraft are not cars. The tolerances are finer, the design keeps changing, and for months the thing stumbles. And then it stops stumbling. By 1944, Willow Run is producing a B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber with a wingspan of 110 feet and more than 1 million parts, roughly once an hour. One plant, 1 hour. Across the whole war, American factories built something in the neighborhood of 300,000 military aircraft. Germany, with the most sophisticated engineering culture in Europe, working around the clock, using slave labor on a scale that still turns your stomach to read about, cannot come close. And then the tanks, which is where the difference becomes philosophical rather than merely numerical. The Germans loved their tanks in a way that was almost personal. A Panther, a Tiger, these were not products. They were the work of skilled men, machines with individual characters, and their crews spoke about them the way cavalrymen once spoke about horses. Each one was expensive, complicated, difficult to build, and difficult to replace. And Germany built them in the low thousands. America built the Sherman, and America did not love the Sherman. It was too tall, its gun was outclassed by 1944, and the men who fought in it had opinions about its habit of catching fire that I will not repeat here. But it could be built in an automobile plant by workers who had never made a weapon before. It could be maintained by a mechanic who had learned his trade on farm equipment in Kansas. It could be shipped, stacked, and replaced. And America made almost 50,000 of them. 50,000. I want to sit with that number for a second, because it is easy to let it slide past. Germany fielded something like 1,600 Tiger tanks in the entire war. Every one of them a masterpiece. Every one of them irreplaceable. The Americans built more Shermans in some individual months than Germany built Tigers in 6 years. By the middle of 1943, the arithmetic branch of German intelligence had essentially finished its work. Their conclusion was not ambiguous. In terms of raw material output, the United States was not competing with Germany. It was operating in a different category of thing entirely, and no amount of German efficiency was going to close the gap. So the German high command did something very human. They accepted the numbers and rejected the conclusion, because they had an answer. And it was not a foolish one. Material is not an army. You can hand a man the finest rifle ever machined, and you have not made him a soldier. You can give him a tank, and he is not a tanker. He is a frightened civilian sitting inside 30 tons of steel he does not understand. War is decided by the man, by his training, by his nerve, at the moment, when nerve is all there is. The Americans could flood the world with equipment, and it would not matter, because equipment does not advance under fire. They believed this completely. And in February of 1943, in the mountains of Tunisia, the Americans handed them what looked like absolute proof. Kasserine Pass was a beating. There is no gentler way to put it, and the men who were there never bothered to try. The American the Second Corps in Tunisia was green in a way that is hard to convey. Units had been thrown into a theater on the far side of an ocean with commanders who had never fought, doctrine that had never been tested, and an alarming faith that competence would arrive on schedule. Their positions were badly sited, spread out along ground that could not support one another. Their intelligence was wrong about where the German attack would come from, and wrong again about how heavy it would be. Their armor was committed piecemeal, in small packets, against concentrated German panzers, which is the oldest way in the world to lose tanks and men at the same time. Rommel's veterans came through the pass and rolled them up. Whole American units broke and ran. Some of them ran for 50 miles. More than 6,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured in a few days. Behind them, scattered across the desert, they left the thing the Germans found most instructive of all: equipment. Trucks, guns, half-tracks, tanks. Some of it brand new, some of it barely used, abandoned by men who had decided that living was more urgent than inventory. German soldiers walked through it and laughed. Here, finally, was the enemy the assessments had promised: well-fed, well-dressed, well-supplied, and completely unwilling to stand and fight. They wrote home about it, they wrote reports about it. The phrase that came back in more than one German evaluation was that the Americans, whatever else they were, lacked the fanatical will that the war demanded. And the veterans of the Eastern Front, the ones who had been shifted west to recover from the meat grinder around Stalingrad, made the comparison that told the whole story of German confidence. The Russians, they said, were terrifying, not because they were skilled, in the German view, but because they simply did not stop. They came in waves that absorbed machine gun fire and kept coming, willing to spend lives at a rate no Western army would tolerate. That was frightening. That was an enemy you could lose to. The Americans, by contrast, seemed careful, slow, reluctant to close, almost fussy about their own lives. So Berlin revised the assessment, and the revision felt like wisdom. Yes, the Americans have an obscene quantity of material, but material handled by amateurs is a gift to a professional. The German soldier will simply take that equipment away from them, as he has just done in Tunisia, and the vast American industrial machine will end up equipping the Wehrmacht. Here is what they missed. Two things happened after Kasserine that told you everything, and neither of them was visible from Berlin. The first is what the Americans did about it. Within weeks, the corps commander was gone, replaced by Patton, who arrived and began firing people and fixing things at a speed that shocked the men under him. Training was rebuilt. Air-ground coordination, which had been chaotic, was reorganized from the bottom. Doctrine on the use of armor was rewritten, then rewritten again. Officers who had failed were relieved without ceremony, and officers who had held together were promoted past men senior to them. By April, the same two corps that had run at Kasserine was pushing German veterans out of hard positions in northern Tunisia. 2 months. That is not the story of a bad army. That is the story of a system that treats defeat as information. The second thing is what Rommel himself said about it. He had just beaten them, and he was not impressed with his own victory. He noted that the Americans were poorly led and inexperienced, which was obvious. But he also noted something the men above him did not want in a report, which was that these people learned. They studied their mistakes with an almost clinical detachment, and they did not make the same one twice. Rommel had been fighting the British for 2 years, and the British were brave and stubborn and slow to adapt. This was different. He had, in effect, warned Berlin that the German advantage in experience had an expiration date, and that the Americans were closing on it faster than anyone had planned for. Nobody listened. It is not really a criticism. Nobody ever listens to that particular warning, because believing it requires admitting that your greatest asset is perishable. Sicily came next, and then the long, ugly, unglamorous climb up the spine of Italy, which was in many ways the worst fighting Americans did in Europe. Mountains, mud, rivers, and a German defense conducted with genuine brilliance by Kasserine, who understood exactly how to make ground cost. Anzio nearly became a catastrophe. Cassino was a nightmare that ground on for months. Nobody who fought in Italy came home thinking they had been part of an unstoppable machine. But something was happening in that fighting that the German commanders noticed and could not quite classify. The Americans they faced in the winter of 1944 were not the Americans of Kasserine. Their artillery had become frighteningly good. Their infantry had learned patience. Their coordination between arms, which had been a shambles in Tunisia, was tightening in a way that no German commander could match with the resources he had. The men were still cautious. They still would not close with a bayonet when they could call for something heavier. but you could no longer make them run. That was the state of the German assessment on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944. Their belief in their own soldiers was intact. They expected the invasion. They believed they could contain it, and if they could contain it, they could win a negotiated peace and turn everything east. Then the Americans came ashore in Normandy, and over the next 8 weeks, the German army in the West learned the truth about what it was fighting. Not on the beaches. The beaches were terrible, and the beaches were heroic, and Omaha earned every word ever written about it, but the beaches were a single day. The revelation came afterward, in the hedgerows, and it did not arrive as a shock. It arrived as a slow, grinding correction to everything they thought they understood about how war works. The bocage country behind the invasion beaches is old farmland, and its fields are divided by earthen banks grown over with hedges, some of them centuries old, roots knotted into walls of dirt that a tank cannot climb and a man cannot see through. Every field is a walled room. Every gap between fields is a door with a machine gun watching it. For defense, it is close to perfect terrain, and the Germans knew how to use it better than anyone alive. Here is what a German company commander expected to happen when his machine gun in the corner of a field opened up on an approaching American platoon. He expected them to do what any professional infantry does: pin the position with a base of fire, work a squad around the flank through the next field, and close on the gun from the side, paying whatever that costs in men. That is the textbook. That is what German infantry would do, what Russian infantry would do, what British infantry would do. It is dangerous, it is expensive, and it is how ground has been taken since the invention of the rifle. What actually happened was something else, and it is the single most important thing in this entire story. The American platoon leader, a 23-year-old lieutenant who 18 months earlier was studying accounting at a state college, went to ground with his men and got on the radio. First, his own company's 60mm mortars came down on the hedgerow. If the gun kept firing, he called the battalion's 81s. If it still kept firing, and here is where the world changes, he called the artillery. And what answered was not a gun, it was a system. Somewhere behind him sat a fire direction center, a room full of men with maps and slide rules and telephone lines, and their job was to take one voice on one radio and turn it into mathematics. They could take a battalion of 12 howitzers, spread across separate positions, each with a different range and a different angle to the target, and calculate individual firing times so that every shell in the air from every gun arrived at the same instant. Time on target, they called it. The first warning the men in that hedgerow received was the explosion, because the sound of the guns firing arrived behind the shells. If the position survived that, and it usually did not, the call went higher. Corps artillery, the heavy battalions, and if the Americans happened to be within about 20 miles of the coast, that lieutenant could ask for the guns of a cruiser or a battleship sitting offshore, and a naval rifle would put a shell the weight of a small automobile into a French farmer's hedge, and the hedge and the machine gun and the crew and a fair amount of the surrounding geography would simply cease to exist. And if the weather was decent, a flight of P-47S would come in on top of all of it, because the 9th Air Force had fighter bombers stacked over the front waiting for something to do, and the Germans had given them the sky by default. Only when the offending patch of Normandy had been erased did the American infantry get up and walk forward. To the next hedgerow, where they did it again. The German officers watching this were not impressed. They were disgusted. It offended everything in them. It looked like cowardice dressed up as procedure, a refusal to fight, an army that would not accept the honest transaction of infantry combat. Prisoners complained about it bitterly. So did after-action reports. There was a note of genuine moral outrage in them, as if the Americans had cheated at cards. But underneath the outrage, if you read those same reports carefully, you can watch the horror arrive. Because the method worked. It ground forward at a crawl, at a cost in shells that no other army on earth could have absorbed, and it killed German soldiers at a rate that Germany could not replace, while spending American lives at a fraction of what a conventional assault would have cost. The Americans were trading steel for blood, and they had steel the way the ocean has water, and they kept improving. When the hedgerows proved impassable to tanks, A sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry, named Curtis Cullen, looked at the German beach obstacles littering the invasion coast, all that scrap steel, and welded a set of prongs to the front of a Sherman so it could cut into the base of an earthen bank and shove through instead of climbing over and exposing its belly. It worked. Within days, engineers were cutting up captured German obstacles and welding these things onto tanks by the hundreds. By the time of the breakout, a large share of American Shermans in Normandy had a device on the front invented by a sergeant 3 weeks earlier, mass-produced in the field, using the enemy's own beach defenses as raw material. That story tells you more about why Germany lost than any statistic about steel production. The idea came from a sergeant. It reached the field in days. Nobody needed permission from Berlin. Then there was the thing about horses, which I did not believe the first time I read it. The German army of 1944 was the army that invented mechanized warfare, and it moved mostly on foot behind animals. The newsreels lied to all of us. We grew up watching columns of panzers and half-tracks, and we assumed that was the Wehrmacht. It was not. It was the sliver of the Wehrmacht that got filmed. The rest of it, the great mass of infantry divisions holding the line in Normandy, marched, and its guns and its ammunition and its field kitchens were pulled by horses. Across the war, Germany used something on the order of 2.75 million of them. A standard German infantry division in 1944 had somewhere around 5,000 horses on its strength, and they had to be fed, shod, watered, and replaced. And they were strafed on the roads like everything else. And the photographs from the retreat across France are full of dead ones. The American army that landed in Normandy had none. Not a token number, none. Every division, from the headquarters down to the rifle company, moved on standardized, brand new, interchangeable vehicles, jeeps, half-tracks, and above all, the 2.5-ton truck, of which America built more than 800,000. The consequence of that is easy to state and almost impossible to overstate. When a German division was ordered 100 miles to plug a hole in the line, it walked. 3 days. 4 if the roads were being strafed, which they were. It arrived exhausted, strung out with its artillery somewhere behind it, and it needed a day to become useful. When an American division got the same order, the men climbed into trucks and were there before dinner, rested, fed, with their guns and their ammunition alongside them and their kitchens set up by dark. Do that for 11 months and the war ends. That is the whole thing. 2 armies with the same map, one of them living in the 20th century and one of them still in its bones in the 19th. There is a related fact that people find hard to accept, so let me put it plainly. The United States did not outproduce Germany by fielding more soldiers. It fielded fewer formations. Germany raised something over 300 divisions in the course of the war. The United States built 90 and then very nearly ran out of infantry replacements in the winter of 1944 and had to scrape rear area units for riflemen, 90 divisions. But each one of them carried a weight of firepower, transport, communications, medical support, and supply that no German formation ever approached. America did not win by being bigger. It won by making each of its pieces worth several of yours and then never letting a single one of them stay broken. All of this came together in the last week of July 1944 in an operation the Americans called Cobra. And after Cobra, there was no serious argument left in the German High Command about the outcome of the war. Bradley picked a narrow strip of front west of Saint-Lô, about 7,000 yards wide. Onto that strip, in a matter of hours, the Allies dropped the bombs of more than 1,500 heavy bombers, plus mediums, plus fighter bombers, plus everything the artillery could reach with. On the receiving end was the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best-equipped armored formations Germany had, built around instructors and veterans. And it was not defeated in the usual sense. It was disassembled. Its commander reported that his frontline units had simply ceased to exist as organized bodies of men. Survivors were found wandering days later, unable to answer questions, their equipment buried under earth that had been rearranged around them. Then, the American armor went through the hole, and the German commanders discovered the second half of the lesson. They expected the methodical, hedgerow by hedgerow advance to continue because that was the only American army they had met. Instead, the Americans stopped being careful. Patton's Third Army came off the leash and drove, bypassing strong points, refusing to secure flanks, ignoring the neat arrows on anyone's map, covering distances in a day that German staff officers considered arithmetically impossible for a force still tied to supply. Columns appeared in places where there was no rational way for them to be. Headquarters were overrun while their staffs were still receiving reports about fighting a day's march away. Hitler's answer was a counterattack at Mortain, the classic German solution, a concentrated, armored punch into the shoulder of the breakthrough. It was well conceived, it was executed by good troops, and it barely got started because Allied codebreakers had read the orders before the German divisions had finished assembling, and because the moment the morning fog lifted, rocket firing, typhoons, and thunderbolts came down on the columns and tore them apart in the open. The attack that was supposed to cut the Americans in half instead pushed the best remaining German armor in France deeper into a pocket that was closing behind it. Around Falaise, tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured, and the roads out of the pocket were choked with wreckage for miles. Eisenhower walked through it afterward and said, "You could step on nothing but dead flesh." The commander of German forces in the West during that collapse was Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, and his reports are worth reading because of what he refuses to say. He does not say his soldiers are failing. He insists, over and over, that his men are fighting as well as men can fight, that his officers are handling their units with skill, that the defense is professional. And then he explains that none of it matters. Every engagement he wins costs him ammunition he cannot get, tanks he cannot replace, and veterans who are gone forever. Every engagement he loses costs him the same, plus ground. There is no result available to him that is not a net loss. He is being consumed at a rate set by the enemy, and nothing his soldiers do can change the rate. In August, Hitler relieved him. On the drive back toward Germany, Kluge stopped the car, wrote a letter to Hitler telling him to end the war, and took poison. Behind the American advance ran the thing that made it possible. And it is my favorite story of the whole campaign because nobody put it in the movies. The French rail network had been destroyed, mostly by Allied bombers and the resistance, and there was no way to move fuel and ammunition forward except by road. So, the Americans built a road. Not a new one, exactly. They took the existing French highways, closed them to all other traffic, made them one-way loops, and ran trucks around them continuously, day and night, for 81 days. They called it the Red Ball Express. At its peak, close to 6,000 trucks were moving something like 12,000 tons of supplies a day, driven by men who worked in shifts around the clock on roads with no lights, in weather, under occasional air attack, at speeds that wrecked the vehicles and sometimes the drivers. About 3/4 of those drivers were black soldiers, serving in a segregated army that had decided men like them were not fit for combat and had put them behind the wheel instead. They kept Patton moving. It is worth saying out loud, since the army that used them spent decades not saying it. By the autumn of 1944, the man Hitler had recalled to command in the West, Gerd von Rundstedt, an aristocrat of the old school with no illusions and no enthusiasm left, had reduced the situation to a sentence any commander can understand. German tactical skill could still win fights. It could not affect the war. A brilliantly handled defense might cost the Americans a week and 300 men, and Germany would pay for that week with tanks and veterans it would never see again, while the Americans replaced their losses out of a pipeline that ran unbroken back through the ports to Detroit and Pittsburgh and Gary, Indiana. That pipeline is the part people underestimate. So consider how the two armies handled a broken tank. A German unit with a damaged Panzer relied on skilled recovery crews and mechanics who could work small miracles with a welding torch and no spare parts. They were superb at it. But the crucial variable was not skill. It was who held the ground at the end of the day, because whoever holds the battlefield recovers the wrecks. Germany was retreating, so every tank that broke down was a tank permanently gone, whether it had been hit or had simply thrown a track. An American unit did not repair the engine in the field. It pulled the whole engine out, dropped in a rebuilt one from a depot, and shipped the old one back to be reconditioned by workers in a rear area who did nothing else. The tank was back in action in a day. Meanwhile, American mechanics were walking the battlefield behind their own advance, dragging in damaged Shermans, cannibalizing, welding, and returning them to the line. A large share of the tanks fighting in the spring of 1945 had already been knocked out at least once. The same logic applied to men, and here, the Americans made a choice their own veterans hated. Instead of pulling a division out of the line to rebuild it as a unit, they fed individual replacements into it while it fought. It was brutal for the new man, who arrived alone among strangers who did not want to learn his name, and it produced casualty rates among replacements that were appalling. But it meant American divisions never stayed weak. A German division bled out and became a name on a map with a few hundred survivors under it. An American division bled and was full again in a week. Hitler made one last attempt to prove that will could beat arithmetic. In December of 1944, he gathered Germany's final reserve, hid it in the Eifel, under fog and radio silence, and threw it into the Ardennes during weather that grounded Allied aircraft. The surprise was total. The plan was operationally elegant. For a few days, it was 1940 again, and there were American units genuinely shattered, thousands taken prisoner, a real hole torn in the line. And then, the Germans discovered what the Americans actually were. The plan had assumed the Americans would behave like the French in 1940, that once the front was pierced, the rear would panic, and the command structure would freeze. Instead, the pieces that were cut off simply refused to leave. Engineers blew bridges in front of panzer columns and held road junctions that no one had ordered them to hold. At Bastogne, surrounded, short of ammunition, freezing, the 101st Airborne received a formal invitation to surrender and answered it with a single word. And the word was not a slogan, it was contempt. Every hour those men held that crossroads was an hour the German timetable did not get back. Then, the machine turned. Patton was 90 miles south, oriented east, preparing an offensive of his own. Ordered to disengage, pivot 90 degrees, and attack north, his staff told him it would take a week to plan. He gave them days. 3 divisions came out of the line, drove through ice and darkness, and hit the flank of the German penetration on the 26th of December. German officers who read the reports refused to accept them, because armies do not do that. Armies of that period genuinely could not do that. The weather cleared 2 days before Christmas, and the sky filled up. Fighter bombers went after the supply columns rather than the tanks, which was the correct answer, and the panzers that had advanced so beautifully rolled to a stop with dry tanks in the snow, some of them within sight of the fuel dumps they had been sent to capture. American artillery, meanwhile, was firing shells with a new proximity fuse that detonated in the air above men in the open, and its effect on infantry caught in forest and field was something the German survivors described in language that does not translate comfortably. The offensive achieved nothing except the destruction of everything Germany had left. That is the final lesson, cleanly stated. America lost around 19,000 dead in the Ardennes, and the divisions that suffered those losses were rebuilt and fighting again within weeks. Germany lost its last armored reserve and its last fuel, and there was nothing behind it. Nothing at all. The rest was administration. In March, a patrol from the 9th Armored Division came around a bend near a town called Remagen and found, absurdly, that the railway bridge across the Rhine was still standing. The demolition charges had partly failed. A lieutenant named Karl Timmermann led men across, and the last natural barrier protecting Germany was crossed by soldiers who had not planned to cross it that day and were mostly surprised to be alive. Within weeks, the Ruhr was encircled, and more than 300,000 German soldiers surrendered in one pocket. Their commander, Walter Model, who had spent the war being called Hitler's fireman, walked into a wood and shot himself. What strikes me most, looking back at all of it, is how much of this survives only because Americans wrote everything down. The same instinct that produced the Fire Direction Center and the depot system produced paperwork on a scale no army had ever attempted. Morning reports listing who was present and who was not. Unit journals kept hour by hour. Hospital admission cards, transfer orders, service records for every single man, filed and forwarded and filed again. That obsessive documentation is why we can still trace one ordinary rifleman through 11 months of Europe. And it is why so many of these stories were recoverable at all. But a great deal of it burned. In 1973, a fire in the Record Center in St. Louis destroyed something like 16 million personnel files. And countless families were left holding a name, a photograph, and a box of objects nobody ever explained to them. I put together a guide to rebuilding a man's service from exactly that much, using the paper trails the fire never touched. It's called Find Your Grandfather's War, linked in the description below if your family has one of those boxes. Because the men in those photographs are the answer to the question this whole story asks. There was one more education waiting for the German army, and it happened far from any battlefield. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were shipped to the United States and moved by train to camps in Texas and Kansas and Iowa, and they spent days looking out of the windows. What they saw was not a nation at war in any sense they recognized. No bomb damage, no ruins, factories running, farms working, lights on at night, towns entirely intact, going about their business 3,000 miles from a war they were winning. Men who had been told America was a hollow, decadent country propped up by propaganda came apart quietly in railway carriages watching Ohio go past. So, when exactly did Germany learn that America was built different? There is no single day. It was an analyst in Berlin in 1942 checking a shipping figure for the fourth time because it could not possibly be right. It was a quartermaster in Normandy walking through a captured American supply dump the size of his hometown, uncovered, in the rain, because nobody thought it needed guarding. It was a company commander watching a hedgerow that had held for a week get erased by a ship he could not see. It was Klug stopping his car. It was a prisoner on a train through Ohio. And underneath all of it was the thing they never got their heads around. They had spent decades measuring armies by the quality of the individual soldier, and they were not wrong that theirs was excellent. But the Americans had built something that did not require excellence. It required competence on a colossal scale from ordinary men. Farmers, mechanics, clerks, teachers, and yes, shopkeepers, trained quickly, equipped extravagantly, organized so that no single one of them had to be a hero for the whole thing to work. Germany built an army for extraordinary men and ran out of them. America built an army for ordinary men and never ran out at all. That is the part I'd want the men in those photographs to know we understood. They were not supposed to be able to do it. Everyone who studied them said so, in writing, with sources. If you want more of these stories, the ones that don't make it into the documentaries, come along with us and subscribe.